Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
I couldn't open it. Have you ever held something people dream about for years, and then realized you were almost afraid to touch it? That was me. The Blue U.S. passport was finally in my hands. I had imagined this moment more times than I could count. I thought I would smile, take pictures, maybe even cry for a few seconds. Instead, I sat alone at my kitchen table in America and stared at that little blue booklet for almost an hour. I never opened it. Not once. Because the truth hiding inside my heart was much heavier than the passport resting in my hands. If you stay with me today, you might discover that this story is not really about a passport at all. It is about marriage, family, second chances, and one quiet decision that completely changed the woman I became. The morning looked completely ordinary. Sunlight slipped through my living room window. My coffee had already gone cold. My husband had left for work an hour earlier, and my children were at school. The house was finally quiet, the kind of quiet that lets memories become louder than sounds. The mail had arrived only 20 minutes before. Inside one plain envelope was the small blue booklet that millions of people recognize immediately. The United States passport. I picked it up carefully. Then I froze. I kept asking myself one strange question. Why am I not happy? From the outside, everything looked perfect. I lived in a peaceful neighborhood. My family was healthy. We had dinner together almost every evening. My English had become good enough that neighbors no longer asked me to repeat myself. Life looked stable. But inside my mind, another movie started playing. Not the beautiful moments, the painful ones, the nights when my husband and I barely spoke, the mornings when I smiled at my children while secretly wondering if our marriage would survive another year, the afternoons when I sat inside my car after grocery shopping because I needed 10 extra minutes just to breathe before walking into the house. No one saw those moments. Social media certainly didn't. Our family photos never did. That blue passport suddenly became a mirror instead of a document. It reflected every version of me I thought I had buried. The frightened wife. The exhausted mother. The woman who once believed love alone could solve every problem. It couldn't. One sentence kept repeating inside my head. This booklet knows nothing about my real journey. People often think the hardest part of life is reaching a destination. Sometimes the hardest part is surviving after you arrive. That lesson surprised me. If you're watching this because you're learning English, I want you to know something important. You don't need to understand every word. Just follow the story. One sentence. One feeling. One moment at a time. That is exactly how I slowly improved my English over the years, not by memorizing thousands of words overnight, but by listening to real stories until they felt familiar. Funny enough, life works the same way. You don't become stronger because one amazing thing happens. You become stronger because hundreds of ordinary days quietly teach you how. When I finally turned the passport over in my hands, I noticed something almost funny. It looked so small. Could something this small really represent years of laughter, disappointment, forgiveness, family dinners, hospital visits, birthday candles, unpaid bills, sleepless nights, difficult conversations, and promises that nearly broke? Of course not. It was only paper. The real journey was invisible. And invisible journeys are always the hardest for other people to understand. That's why today's story matters. Not because I became an American citizen. Not because of government paperwork. Not because of a blue booklet. But because I almost lost something much more valuable long before I ever held this passport. My family. You may be wondering what happened. Was someone unfaithful? Did we separate? Did I discover a secret? I wish the answer were that simple. Sometimes marriages don't break because of one terrible event. Sometimes they slowly become strangers while sitting at the same dinner table every night. Nobody prepares you for that. Especially in America, where life moves incredibly fast. Everyone is busy. Everyone has schedules. Everyone has responsibilities. You wake up early. Drive. Work. Cook. Clean. Pay bills. Sleep. Repeat. One day you suddenly look across the table and quietly wonder, when did we stop really talking? That question frightened me more than any interview, any official letter, or any important document ever could. Looking back now, I realize the passport didn't change my life that morning. It simply forced me to stop pretending that everything before it had been easy. It made me tell myself the truth. And sometimes the truth is the greatest gift life can give us. So, if you're here expecting a story about immigration documents, you're going to hear something much deeper. You're going to hear the story of a woman who almost confused achievement with happiness. A wife who learned that silence can be louder than arguments. A mother who discovered that children notice love long before they understand words. And someone who slowly rebuilt her confidence, one ordinary conversation at a time. By the end of this journey, you may never look at a passport the same way again, because sometimes the smallest booklet can hold the biggest reminder. Not of where you can travel, but of who you almost stopped becoming. The passport changed nothing. Or did it? The next morning, I did something that probably sounds ridiculous. I left my brand new U.S. passport inside the kitchen drawer and completely forgot about it for several hours. If someone had walked into my house expecting balloons, celebration photos, or an emotional speech, they would have been terribly disappointed. Instead, I was standing in the laundry room matching socks that somehow never seemed to belong to the same pair. My daughter was asking where her favorite sweater had gone. My son couldn't find his backpack, even though it was exactly where we had left it the night before. My husband was searching for his car keys while holding them in his own hand. I laughed quietly because life has a funny way of reminding us that even after a big milestone, ordinary mornings continue exactly as they always have. The blue passport hadn't changed breakfast. It hadn't made the laundry disappear. It hadn't magically turned marriage into something effortless. It simply sat in the drawer while real life kept moving. As I watched my family rush through another weekday morning, one thought refused to leave me. What if this is the real achievement? Not the passport, not the document, not the official status. This noisy, imperfect, beautiful little family. For years, I believed that happiness arrived after reaching the next milestone. Finish this paperwork. Reach this goal. Save more money. Buy a better home. Celebrate the next achievement. Then life would finally feel complete. But life kept teaching me the opposite. Every time I reached one destination, another ordinary Tuesday was waiting for me. That realization was strangely comforting, because it meant happiness had never been hiding inside future accomplishments. It had been quietly sitting beside me while I was too busy chasing something else. Still, America has a way of making people run. Run toward bigger careers. Run toward higher salaries. Run toward larger homes. Run toward perfect social media photos. Sometimes we run so fast that we forget to ask whether the direction still matches the life we actually want. I almost made that mistake. Our family wasn't wealthy. We weren't struggling either. We lived what many people would call a comfortable middle-class life. My husband worked hard. I worked hard too. The bills were paid. The refrigerator stayed full. Our children laughed more often than they cried. From the outside, everything looked successful. Yet there were evenings when we both sat on the same couch, looking at different screens, saying almost nothing to each other. No fighting.
No shouting.
Just silence. I've learned that silence inside a marriage can be surprisingly dangerous. Not because silence is always bad, but because it sometimes becomes a habit. One quiet evening becomes another, then another. Soon months have passed. You know each other's schedules better than each other's thoughts. That realization frightened me more than any difficult conversation ever had. Psychologists often explain that healthy relationships are built through small, consistent moments of emotional connection rather than dramatic romantic gestures. Looking back, that made perfect sense. We didn't need a luxury vacation to repair our relationship. We needed 5 uninterrupted minutes of honest conversation without phones, without television, without rushing somewhere else. 5 minutes. That sounded almost too simple. Yet simple things are often the hardest to practice. Around that time, I also noticed something interesting about my English. Years earlier, I believed fluency meant speaking perfectly. Now I realized fluency simply meant feeling comfortable enough to connect with people. Sometimes I made grammar mistakes. Sometimes I searched for the right word. Nobody cared nearly as much as I imagined. People remembered kindness far longer than perfect pronunciation. That lesson changed the way I learned English forever. Instead of chasing perfection, I started chasing connection. Short conversations at the grocery store. Friendly chats with neighbors. Asking questions instead of worrying about making mistakes. Little by little, confidence replaced fear. Oddly enough, the same principle helped my marriage. Stop trying to sound perfect. Start trying to be honest. One evening, my husband looked at me across the dinner table and smiled. "You've been laughing more lately," he said. I hadn't even noticed. Maybe because I wasn't constantly measuring my life against impossible expectations anymore. Children notice these changes long before adults do. Our daughter began telling longer stories about school. Our son started asking if we could all eat dinner together without anyone checking a phone. Neither request cost any money. Neither required expensive planning. Yet both made our home feel warmer. Living in the United States also taught me something many people rarely discuss. Freedom comes with responsibility. People often focus on rights. But everyday life here quietly depends on respecting rules, keeping promises, arriving on time, caring for neighbors, and contributing to the community. Those habits seem small. Together they build trust. And trust is the invisible foundation of every healthy society. The same is true inside a family. Promises matter. Listening matters. Showing up matters. The passport resting inside my kitchen drawer represented citizenship. But citizenship itself wasn't teaching me those lessons. Life was. Marriage was. Motherhood was. Every ordinary day was. Late that afternoon, I finally opened the drawer again. The blue booklet was still there, exactly where I had left it. I held it for only a few seconds before closing the drawer once more. This time I smiled, not because everything in my life had become perfect. It hadn't. There were still disagreements waiting to happen. Unexpected bills, stressful weeks, parenting challenges, long work days. Laundry that somehow multiplied overnight. Real life wasn't disappearing, but something inside me had quietly changed. For the first time in years, I stopped asking whether I had achieved enough. Instead, I began asking a different question. Am I protecting the life we've worked so hard to build? That single question would soon uncover a truth about my marriage that neither my husband nor I had been brave enough to admit aloud. And when that truth finally surfaced, it changed everything. The secret we never shared. If someone had asked me back then whether my husband and I were happy, I would have answered without hesitation, "Of course we are." It wasn't exactly a lie. It simply wasn't the whole truth. That's the strange thing about marriage. Sometimes the biggest problems aren't hidden because people are dishonest. They're hidden because even the couple living inside the story doesn't realize they're slowly drifting apart. Looking back now, I can honestly say that the greatest danger to our family wasn't another person, financial disaster, or some dramatic betrayal. It was something much quieter. Something so ordinary that millions of couples across America experience it every single day without noticing until it's almost too late. And one evening, completely by accident, I discovered the warning sign that changed everything. It happened on a Thursday. Nothing extraordinary had happened. Dinner was finished. The dishes were clean. The children were upstairs finishing homework. My husband sat on one end of the couch. I sat on the other. The television was on. Neither of us was actually watching it. For nearly 40 minutes, the only sounds in the room came from the television and our phones. Then I looked up. At exactly the same moment, he looked up too. Our eyes met. For perhaps 2 seconds. Then we both looked back down. That tiny moment frightened me more than any argument we had ever had.
Why?
Because I suddenly realized we had become incredibly good roommates. But we were forgetting how to be husband and wife. That realization stayed with me all night. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it while making breakfast. How had we arrived here? There hadn't been a dramatic fight. No one had packed a suitcase. Nobody had threatened divorce. Instead, life had slowly stolen our attention one ordinary day after another. Work deadlines, school schedules, laundry, mortgage payments, doctor appointments, weekend errands. Everything seemed important. Everything demanded immediate attention. Except us. Researchers who study long-term relationships often describe something called emotional bids. These are tiny moments when one person reaches for connection, sometimes with nothing more than a question, a smile, or a simple comment about their day. Healthy couples usually respond to these small invitations more often than they ignore them. I didn't know the scientific term back then, but I suddenly realized how many emotional bids we had quietly missed. Look at this funny video. I'm tired today. Guess what happened at work? Can you believe what our son said? Those weren't random conversations. They were opportunities, tiny bridges, and we had stopped crossing them. Instead, our conversations had become almost entirely logistical. What time is soccer practice? Did you pay the electricity bill? Who's picking up groceries? Don't forget the dentist appointment. Useful? Absolutely. Meaningful? Not anymore. I remember standing in the grocery store later that afternoon, watching an older couple. The husband accidentally grabbed the wrong brand of cereal. His wife laughed. He laughed too. Then he kissed her forehead before putting the box back on the shelf. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Most shoppers probably never noticed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. They weren't laughing because life was perfect. They were laughing because somewhere along the way they had protected something my husband and I were quietly neglecting. Connection. When I arrived home, I found the blue passport still resting inside the kitchen drawer. For some reason, I picked it up again. I traced the gold letters with my finger. United States of America. Passport. Official. Secure. Recognized around the world. Then another thought appeared in my mind. A passport proves where you belong legally. It doesn't prove where your heart feels safe. That sentence stayed with me. Because safety inside a marriage isn't created by marriage certificates. It's created by thousands of tiny moments when two people continue choosing each other. Even after the excitement fades. Even after children arrive. Even after routines become exhausting. That evening something unexpected happened. Instead of turning on the television, I asked my husband a question. Not about work. Not about bills. Not about the children. I simply asked, When was the last time you felt completely relaxed? He looked surprised, almost confused. Nobody had asked him that in a long time. He smiled a little before answering. I honestly don't remember. Then he asked me the same question. I couldn't answer either. For the first time in months, maybe even years, we weren't discussing responsibilities.
We were discussing ourselves.
The conversation lasted almost an hour. There were awkward pauses. There were quiet moments. There were things we admitted that neither of us had wanted to say out loud. I've been exhausted. I thought you didn't need me anymore. I didn't want to bother you. I thought you were happier when I stayed quiet. None of those statements were true. They were assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. One misunderstanding had quietly created another until silence became our normal language. That night taught me one of the biggest lessons of my life. Most relationships don't collapse because love disappears overnight. They weaken because curiosity disappears first. People stop asking questions. Stop listening carefully. Stop wondering what the other person is feeling today instead of last year. Ironically, that lesson also transformed the way I practiced English. I stopped worrying about perfect grammar every time I spoke. Instead, I became curious. Curious enough to ask another question. Curious enough to continue the conversation. Curiosity creates connection. Perfection creates pressure. Connection always wins. As I went upstairs to check on the children before bed, I noticed something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. They were laughing together in one room. They had no idea that downstairs, their parents had just begun rebuilding something invisible. Trust. Not because of one dramatic promise. Not because of one emotional speech. But because two tired adults finally chose to stop pretending everything was fine. I believe that conversation had solved our biggest problem. I was wrong. It had only uncovered the first layer. A much deeper truth about our marriage was still waiting quietly beneath the surface. And when it finally revealed itself, I understood why I had stared at that blue passport for nearly an hour. A house full of silence. The truth I was about to discover wasn't hidden inside a locked drawer, an old message, or a secret bank account. It was hiding in something much more dangerous because it looked completely normal. One Saturday afternoon, I walked through my own house and suddenly realized that every room was filled with noise. But almost none of it came from the people I loved. The washing machine was running. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen. The television played in the background. My son's video game echoed upstairs. My daughter's music leaked softly through her bedroom door. My husband's laptop kept making notification sounds from the dining table. My own phone vibrated every few minutes. The house sounded alive, yet somehow it felt emotionally empty. That was the moment a frightening thought entered my mind. What if families don't slowly fall apart because they stop loving each other? What if they slowly fall apart because everyday noise becomes louder than every meaningful conversation? I stood there without moving, and for the first time since holding that blue passport, I understood why I couldn't celebrate it. Deep inside, I knew I wasn't afraid of losing a document. I had been afraid of losing the people sitting only a few feet away from me. It sounds dramatic now, but at that moment I honestly felt as if someone had quietly switched off the warmth inside our home without anyone noticing. Nothing looked wrong. Our living room was clean. Family photos covered the hallway. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen counter. The refrigerator was full. The calendar was packed with birthdays, soccer practice, school meetings, and family plans. If a neighbor had visited, they probably would have said we had a wonderful life. Maybe we did. But beautiful homes can still contain lonely hearts. That afternoon I decided to do something unusual. I walked over to the television. I turned it off. Nobody reacted. I waited. Almost 30 seconds passed before anyone noticed. Then I walked toward my husband and gently closed his laptop. He looked up confused. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I smiled. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Our daughter came downstairs. She looked around the unusually quiet room. "Why is it so quiet?" she asked. Her question made me smile. Children are amazingly honest. Adults become used to constant distraction. Children notice when it disappears. I invited everyone to sit together. No television.
No phones. No laptops.
Just 4 people sharing the same room. At first, the silence felt awkward, almost uncomfortable. It's amazing how quickly people become addicted to background noise. Psychologists often explain that the human brain dislikes uncomfortable silence because silence leaves room for emotions we've been avoiding. That idea suddenly made perfect sense to me. Maybe we weren't constantly busy because our lives demanded it. Maybe we stayed busy because slowing down forced us to notice what was missing. I looked at my husband. "When was the last time we all sat together without a screen?" He laughed nervously. "I honestly can't remember." Neither could I. Our son finally broke the silence. "Can we just talk?" Such a simple sentence. Yet somehow it landed like a wake-up call. So we talked. Not about homework. Not about schedules. Not about money. Instead, everyone answered one simple question. "What was the best part of your week?" Our daughter spoke first. She described helping a new student feel welcome at school. My son proudly explained how he finally solved a difficult science project. My husband talked about mentoring a younger coworker who reminded him of himself years ago. Then everyone looked at me. I hesitated. Finally, I answered. The best part of my week was realizing I still have time to become a better wife and mother. Nobody expected that answer. Neither did I. It simply came out. My husband reached over and quietly held my hand. Not dramatically. Not like a movie scene. Just naturally. That small gesture reminded me of something I had forgotten. Love doesn't disappear overnight. Sometimes it simply waits patiently beneath routine until someone reaches for it again. Living in America has taught me many practical lessons. People often admire efficiency, schedules, productivity, planning. Those things absolutely matter. But there's another lesson that's just as important. Protect your relationships with the same care you protect your career. Success at work means very little if home becomes the place where nobody feels seen. I started paying closer attention during the following days. Every evening after dinner, I noticed the same pattern. Everyone instinctively reached for a device, including me. Not because we didn't love one another, because habits are powerful. Researchers estimate that many daily habits happen automatically with very little conscious thought. That means families aren't shaped only by big decisions. They're shaped by hundreds of tiny routines repeated over and over again. Change the routine, and eventually you begin changing the relationship. So we created one tiny family rule. Nothing complicated. For 30 minutes every evening, every screen stayed off. That was all. 30 minutes. At first it felt surprisingly difficult. We kept reaching for phones that weren't there. Someone would remember an email. Someone else wanted to check the weather. Another notification would buzz from another room. Little by little, the urge faded. Conversations grew longer. Laughter returned more often. Even disagreements felt healthier because they happened face to face instead of between distractions. Around that same time, I noticed another unexpected change. My English continued improving almost without effort. Not because I was studying longer. Because I was listening more carefully. To my neighbors. To my children. To my husband. Real conversations became my classroom. I stopped chasing perfect vocabulary. Instead, I focused on understanding emotions hidden inside simple words. Ironically, that's how language becomes natural. The same way relationships become stronger. One honest conversation at a time. One shared laugh. One difficult truth. One ordinary evening that nobody photographs. A week later, I opened the kitchen drawer again and looked at my blue passport. This time I smiled for a completely different reason. I finally understood why I had stared at it for nearly an hour. It wasn't reminding me of where I belonged. It was reminding me who belonged with me. But just as peace began returning to our home, one unexpected phone call arrived that forced my husband and me to make a decision neither of us saw coming, a decision that would test everything we had just started rebuilding. One conversation saved. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and for a few seconds, I honestly believed it was going to ruin everything we had spent weeks trying to rebuild. My husband answered first. I watched his expression slowly change from relaxed to serious to completely silent. He thanked the caller, ended the conversation, and simply stared out the kitchen window without saying a single word. I didn't ask him what had happened right away, because something inside me whispered that this wasn't just another ordinary problem. The silence felt familiar, and that frightened me. Only a few weeks earlier, we would have hidden our worries from each other until they quietly grew into something much bigger. But this time, I promised myself the story would be different. The blue U.S. passport was still resting inside the kitchen drawer, yet once again it reminded me of something unexpected. Documents can change your legal identity overnight, but only honest conversations can change the direction of a family. I took a deep breath, sat beside my husband, and asked the simplest question I could think of. Do you want to tell me what you're thinking? That one sentence became the turning point I never saw coming. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rubbed his hands together and looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. Finally, he spoke. My company is reorganizing. That was all. Just 4 words. Yet they carried the weight of 100 unanswered questions. Would his position change? Would our schedule change? Would he need to travel more? Would our family lose the peaceful routine we had just begun rebuilding? The uncertainty filled the room. Years ago, we would have reacted very differently. One of us would have tried to solve everything immediately. The other would have stayed quiet, pretending not to worry. Neither approach ever worked. This time, something surprising happened. Nobody tried to fix the future. We simply listened. For several minutes, my husband explained everything he knew, which honestly wasn't very much. The company wanted him to lead a larger team. The promotion sounded impressive. Better salary, more responsibility, longer hours, more business trips. Everyone around him expected him to accept without hesitation. After all, that's what success is supposed to look like, isn't it? He looked at me carefully. I should probably say yes. I noticed something interesting. He said should, not want. Sometimes one small word reveals the biggest truth. I smiled gently. What do you want? He laughed softly. I don't remember the last time someone asked me that. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Rain tapped quietly against the windows. Our children were still at school. The house felt unusually peaceful. Then he admitted something I never expected to hear. I'm afraid we'll lose what we've finally started finding. I understood immediately. He wasn't talking about money. He wasn't talking about career opportunities. He was talking about us. Only a month earlier, neither of us would have admitted that out loud. Now we could. Psychologists often explain that people experience less stress when they feel heard, even before a solution appears. Looking back, I completely believe that. His shoulders relaxed before we had made a single decision. Nothing outside our home had changed. The company hadn't changed its plans. The future was still uncertain. But inside our kitchen, something important had already happened. He no longer felt alone. Neither did I. We spent nearly an hour discussing possibilities. Not arguing. Not debating. Simply wondering together. What kind of life were we actually trying to build? The answer surprised both of us. Neither of us mentioned a bigger house. Neither of us mentioned a newer car. Neither of us mentioned expensive vacations. Instead, we talked about family dinners, weekend breakfasts, watching our children grow up before they suddenly became adults, laughing together after long days, having enough energy left to ask each other, "How was your day?" Success suddenly looked very different. Living in the United States often encourages people to dream bigger, work harder, and chase the next opportunity. There is nothing wrong with ambition. In fact, ambition helped our family build a comfortable life. But I also learned that every opportunity quietly asks for something in return. Sometimes the price is time. Sometimes it's peace. She had sketched our family sitting around the dinner table. For smiling faces. One dog she drew much larger than he actually was. Above the picture, she had written one sentence. "My favorite time is dinner together." She had no idea what conversation her father and I had just finished. Children rarely know the details, because it quietly reminded us what mattered. A few days later, my husband made his decision. He accepted the new position, but with one important condition. He asked for a schedule that protected family evenings whenever possible and reduced unnecessary travel. To his surprise, the company agreed. He later told me something that made me laugh. I spent days worrying about asking, and they said yes in less than 5 minutes. How many fears exist only inside our own minds? Probably more than we realize. Around the same time, I noticed another unexpected change in myself. When neighbors spoke with me, I no longer worried about finding perfect English words. I listened first. I answered naturally. Sometimes I paused. Sometimes I smiled while searching for vocabulary. Nobody minded. Real communication had replaced perfect performance. That lesson reached far beyond language. The strongest marriages aren't built by saying flawless things. They're built by saying honest things. As the weeks passed, our evenings slowly became my favorite part of every day. Dinner, conversation, homework, laughter, sometimes complete exhaustion. Real life, beautifully imperfect. One night, before going to bed, I opened the kitchen drawer once again. The blue passport was still there. This time I finally opened it. I looked at my photograph for only a second before closing it again. Because I had finally understood something that no government document could ever teach me. Identity isn't created by the country printed on the cover. It's shaped by the choices you make inside your home every ordinary day. I thought that lesson was the greatest one waiting for me. I couldn't have been more wrong. Just a few weeks later, something my daughter quietly asked at the dinner table would expose a truth about our family that neither my husband nor I had ever dared to face. And after hearing her question, I couldn't sleep that entire night. Our family feels different now. The question my daughter asked that evening sounded so innocent that everyone at the dinner table smiled at first. Then nobody spoke. She looked at me, looked at her father, and quietly said, "Mom, if you and Dad love being together now, why didn't you laugh like this last year?" I felt my fork stop halfway to my plate. My husband looked down without saying a word. Our son glanced back and forth between us, waiting for someone to answer. Children have an extraordinary ability to ask the one question adults spend months avoiding. That single sentence echoed inside my mind long after dinner ended. I couldn't sleep that night because I realized something painful. We thought we had hidden our struggles from our children. We hadn't. They noticed everything. They noticed the quiet dinners. They noticed the short conversations. They noticed how often we were physically together, but emotionally somewhere else. And suddenly, the blue U.S. passport resting safely inside my drawer felt smaller than ever. It represented one important achievement, yes, but the greatest responsibility in front of me wasn't being a citizen. The next morning, I watched my daughter getting ready for school. She was humming a song while packing her lunch. She looked happy. Children recover quickly when they feel secure. Adults often need much longer. As she reached the front door, she turned around and smiled. "See you tonight." Those 4 simple words suddenly meant much more than they ever had before. Not "see you later."
Not bye.
She expected all of us to be together again at dinner. That expectation was something we had rebuilt without even realizing it. After everyone left the house, I made myself another cup of coffee and sat near the same kitchen window where I had stared at my passport weeks earlier. Outside, nothing looked extraordinary. Neighbors walked their dogs. School buses disappeared around the corner. Delivery trucks stopped from house to house. Life in our American neighborhood moved with its usual rhythm. Yet inside me, something had permanently shifted. For years, I believed children learned mainly from what parents taught. Now I understood something completely different. Children learn even more from what parents repeatedly do. They watch. They notice. They remember. Not every word, but every pattern. Psychologists have long observed that children often develop their understanding of relationships by watching the emotional habits they see at home. They notice tone of voice, patience, eye contact, kindness, and even silence. That realization made me pause. If my daughter someday built a family of her own, what kind of marriage did I want her to remember? One filled with stress? My son accidentally dropped an entire glass of orange juice across the kitchen table. A year earlier, one of us probably would have reacted with frustration. Instead, everyone froze for 1 second. Then my husband started laughing. Not because the mess was funny, because accidents happen. Our son looked surprised. "I thought you'd be mad." My husband grabbed a towel. "It's only juice." Within 2 minutes, the table was clean again. But something much bigger had happened. Fear hadn't entered the room. Grace had. That tiny moment reminded me that homes are not remembered for being perfect. They're remembered for how people respond when life becomes imperfect. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that America had taught me many lessons beyond language or paperwork. One lesson stood out above the rest. People come from different backgrounds, cultures, traditions, and beliefs. Every family creates its own version of home. No 2 are exactly alike. But almost every happy family shares one invisible habit. They intentionally spend time together. Not because they always feel like it. Because relationships don't grow automatically. Just like gardens, they need attention before weeds quietly take over. That idea even changed the way I practiced English. Instead of setting aside long, exhausting study sessions, I began connecting language with everyday life. Reading a recipe, talking with a cashier, listening to a neighbor's story, helping my children with homework. Sometimes I learned only one useful expression in an entire day. Surprisingly, those small lessons stayed with me much longer than hours of memorization. Progress became something gentle, not stressful. Life itself became my classroom. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to visit a nearby community park. Nothing expensive, nothing carefully planned. Children played basketball. Families walked their dogs. Grandparents pushed strollers. Teenagers laughed while sharing pizza. I sat on a bench watching everything around me. For a moment, I forgot about goals,
Deadlines.
achievements, even the passport. The secret is making everyone want to come back. I kept thinking about her words all evening, making everyone want to come back. Back to the dinner table, back to family conversations, back to trust, back to home. Perhaps that is what every family is really trying to build. Not a perfect house, not a perfect schedule, a place where people feel emotionally safe enough to return after facing the world outside. That night, after the children were asleep, my husband found me standing quietly in the kitchen. He smiled. Looking at the passport again? I laughed.
No.
He opened the drawer anyway. The blue booklet was exactly where it had always been. He held it up.
Funny, he said.
A few weeks ago, this seemed like the biggest moment of our lives. And now? I asked. He looked toward the hallway where our children's family photos covered the wall. Now it just feels like another page. I nodded. Because he was right. The passport marked a milestone. Our family was writing the story. As I turned off the kitchen light before going upstairs, I believed the hardest chapter was finally behind us. I had no idea that only a few days later, an unexpected visitor would arrive at our front door carrying a conversation that would completely change the way I understood gratitude, belonging, and the true meaning of holding that little blue booklet in my hands. Why I stared at the blue booklet. The knock on our front door came just after sunset, and for some reason, I hesitated before answering it. I wasn't expecting visitors. My husband was helping our son finish a science project at the dining table, and my daughter was practicing piano upstairs. Everything felt peaceful, almost unusually peaceful. When I opened the door, I found our elderly neighbor standing there with a warm smile and a small homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in a towel. I was baking too much again, she laughed. We invited her inside, and none of us realized that one simple conversation over coffee would uncover the real reason I had stared at my blue U.S. passport for nearly an hour. It wasn't because I couldn't believe it belonged to me. It wasn't because I was overwhelmed with excitement. It was because, deep inside, I had been asking one question that millions of people never say out loud. Do I finally belong? Or have I only learned how to fit in? At first, those two ideas sound identical, but they are completely different. And understanding that difference quietly changed the way I looked at my family, my life in America, and even the woman I had become. Our neighbor looked around the house and smiled. It feels warm in here. She wasn't talking about the temperature. Somehow she noticed what had changed. Only a few months earlier, our evenings had been filled with distractions. Now, they were filled with conversation. She accepted a cup of coffee and sat with us for almost an hour. We talked about ordinary things. The changing weather, the children growing so quickly, the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic. Yet before she left, she said something that stayed with me long after the front door closed. You know, she said softly, a house becomes a home when people feel safe enough to be themselves. I stood there silently. Safe enough to be themselves. Those words followed me into the kitchen. Without thinking, I opened the drawer once again. The blue passport was still there. I picked it up and turned it over slowly. For the first time, I finally understood why I couldn't celebrate it the day it arrived. Years ago, I believed belonging came from achieving something. Learning enough English. Building a successful family. Receiving an official document. Reaching another milestone. But belonging had quietly arrived long before the passport. It arrived the evening my husband and I chose honest conversation instead of comfortable silence. It arrived when our daughter laughed freely at the dinner table. It arrived when our son stopped worrying that spilling orange juice would make someone angry. It arrived when our family became emotionally present again. The passport simply reminded me to notice it. That realization felt strangely freeing. America often celebrates achievement. Work hard. Dream bigger. Keep moving forward. Those values are inspiring. They encourage people to grow. But somewhere along the way, I had confused achievement with identity. I thought each accomplishment would finally answer the question, am I enough? The surprising truth was this. No document could answer that. Only the way I lived each ordinary day could. Psychologists often describe belonging as one of our deepest emotional needs. People who feel accepted by family, friends, or community generally experience greater well-being than those who constantly feel they must prove themselves. Looking back, I understood exactly what they meant. For years, I had unknowingly treated life like an endless exam. Every success temporarily made me feel secure. Every mistake made me question myself again. That cycle was exhausting. One evening, while helping my daughter with her homework, she asked me to read a short story aloud. The sentences were simple. The vocabulary wasn't difficult. Halfway through, she smiled. "Mom, your English sounds so natural now." I laughed. "If only you had heard me years ago." She looked surprised. "Were you scared?" I nodded. "Almost every day." She thought about that for a second. "But you kept talking anyway." Children have a remarkable way of finding the simplest truth.
Yes.
I kept talking anyway, not because I was fearless, because life kept giving me reasons to continue. That's exactly how confidence grows. Not all at once. One conversation, one mistake, one smile, one ordinary day at a time. I hope that's something you remember while listening to my story. If English isn't your first language, please don't wait until you feel perfect. Speak kindly. Listen patiently.
Keep going.
Real communication has never required perfection. It requires courage. The funny thing is that marriage follows the same rule. Nobody becomes the perfect husband or wife. People simply continue choosing each other through ordinary moments. Some days gracefully. Some days awkwardly. But always intentionally. A few weekends later, our family visited a local farmer's market. Fresh vegetables. Homemade bread. Children running between small booths. Musicians playing on a street corner. Nothing extraordinary. Yet I found myself smiling almost the entire morning. Not because life had become easier. Because I had finally stopped measuring my happiness against giant milestones. Instead, I noticed tiny blessings. A shared cup of coffee. Holding my husband's hand while crossing the street. Listening to my children argue over which apples tasted sweeter. Watching strangers smile at one another. Ordinary moments suddenly felt extraordinary. As we walked back to the car, my husband looked at me and asked, "What are you smiling about?" I answered honestly, "I think I finally understand the passport." He laughed. "It took you long enough." "It wasn't about the passport." "I know," he replied. "It never was." His answer made me stop walking. He had understood before I did. The little blue booklet had never represented the end of my journey. It represented a reminder. Never confuse where you live with how you live. Never confuse achievement with peace. Never confuse success with love. When we arrived home, I placed the passport back inside its drawer one last time. This time I didn't stare at it. I simply closed the drawer with a grateful heart. Because the thing I had searched for wasn't inside that booklet. It had quietly been waiting around my own dinner table all along. I thought I had finally learned every lesson this little blue passport had to teach me. Then, only days later, one unexpected letter arrived in our mailbox. A letter that would challenge everything I believed about gratitude, purpose, and what kind of legacy I wanted to leave for my children long after every document, every milestone, and every achievement had faded into memory. What Every family should know. The letter waiting in our mailbox looked completely ordinary, but before I even opened it, I had this strange feeling that it was about to ask me a question I wasn't ready to answer. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't an official government notice. It wasn't even related to my passport. It was an invitation from our local community center asking families to volunteer during an upcoming neighborhood event. Most people would probably read it in less than 30 seconds and either accept or throw it away. I almost did the same. Then my daughter walked into the kitchen, picked up the envelope, and smiled. "Can we do it together?" she asked. Such a simple question. Yet somehow it reached much deeper than I expected. For weeks, I had been thinking about what the Blue U.S. passport meant. That afternoon, I began wondering about something much more important. What does it actually mean to belong to a community? Is it enough to live in a neighborhood, or does belonging begin only when you decide to care about the people living around you? As I held that invitation in one hand and remembered the passport resting quietly in the kitchen drawer, I realized that one small booklet could tell the world who I was on paper, but only my daily actions could tell people who I truly was. The following Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and clear blue skies. Families slowly gathered at the neighborhood park. Some volunteers prepared food. Others organized games for children. A few older neighbors arranged tables and folding chairs while teenagers carried boxes filled with supplies. Nobody asked where anyone came from. Nobody cared what kind of job someone had. Everyone simply started helping. Watching that scene quietly changed something inside me. For years, I had believed that building a good life depended mainly on personal success. Work harder, save more, achieve more,
Become more.
but standing there with my family, wearing a simple volunteer name tag, I suddenly understood another American value that people don't always talk about. Strong communities are built by ordinary people doing small things consistently, not because they're required to.
Because they choose to.
My husband spent the morning helping set up picnic tables. Our son carried bottles of water from one station to another with the determination of someone completing a very important mission. Our daughter painted cheerful faces on children who couldn't stop giggling every time she held the little paintbrush near their noses. I worked at the welcome table greeting families as they arrived. Something interesting happened. I spoke with dozens of people that morning. Some conversations lasted only 20 seconds. Others continued for several minutes. Years earlier, I would have worried about every English sentence. Now I focused on something completely different, making people feel welcome. If I needed an extra second to find the right word, I simply smiled. Nobody seemed bothered. In fact, people smiled back. That day reminded me that communication isn't only about vocabulary. It's about kindness, eye contact, patience, listening. Sometimes a warm smile says more than perfect grammar ever could. Around lunchtime, an older gentleman sat beside me while eating a sandwich. He noticed my volunteer badge and asked how long our family had lived in the neighborhood. We talked for several minutes. Before leaving, he said something I'll never forget. The best neighbors aren't the ones who live next door. He smiled. They're the ones who show up. Such a short sentence. Yet it stayed with me all afternoon. Showing up, not just physically, emotionally. Helping when someone needs support. Checking on an elderly neighbor after a storm. Waving to people instead of rushing past them. Respecting community rules. Driving carefully through residential streets. Cleaning up after family picnics. Returning shopping carts. Thanking teachers. Being patient with service workers. These actions seem almost invisible. Together, they quietly shape the places where we live. Living in the United States taught me that freedom and responsibility grow together. People often celebrate individual independence, but healthy communities also depend on mutual respect. You don't always notice these habits when they're working well. You notice them only when they disappear. The same principle applies inside a family. Trust grows through ordinary consistency, not dramatic promises. Researchers studying family relationships often explain that emotional security develops through repeated positive interactions rather than occasional grand gestures. Looking back at our own home, I finally understood why our children seemed happier. We hadn't transformed our lives overnight. We had simply changed hundreds of tiny moments. We listened more carefully. We apologized more quickly. We laughed more often. We looked up from our phones more frequently. Small habits created a completely different atmosphere. Late that afternoon, our family helped clean the park before heading home. Everyone looked tired. Our shoes were dusty. The children were hungry. Yet nobody complained. As we drove back, my son looked out the car window and quietly said, "I like helping people." No speech could have made me happier. Not because he had volunteered once, because he had discovered that kindness feels rewarding. When we arrived home, I opened the kitchen drawer almost automatically. The blue passport was still there. This time I didn't pick it up. I simply looked at it for a few seconds. Then I closed the drawer again. I finally understood that the passport had never been asking me where I could travel. It had quietly been asking a different question all along. What kind of person will you be wherever you live? That question no longer frightened me. It inspired me. As evening settled over our neighborhood, we shared another peaceful family dinner. Everyone talked at once. Everyone laughed. The room felt wonderfully alive. Then my husband looked at me and said something that made the entire table fall silent. "I think the children are finally seeing the real version of us." His words filled me with gratitude, but they also made me realize one final truth I had not yet shared with anyone. The greatest gift our children would ever receive from us would never be a passport, a house, or even financial security. It would be the example of two imperfect parents who chose day after day to keep growing, keep listening, keep loving, and never stop becoming better than they were yesterday. English became my daily habit. A few months after I received my Blue U.S. passport, someone at a neighborhood cafe asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. She smiled, stirred her coffee, and said, "So, what's the secret? How did your English become so natural?" I almost laughed because she assumed there had been some magical method, an expensive course, or years of perfect discipline. The truth was much less exciting, yet far more powerful. I looked at her for a second before answering. I stopped trying to learn English and started trying to live my life. She looked confused. I don't blame her. If someone had told me that years earlier, I probably would have thought the same thing. But the greatest surprise wasn't that my English had changed. The greatest surprise was that my marriage had changed first. My confidence had changed first. My daily habits had changed first. The language simply followed. And as I drove home that afternoon, I realized something almost unbelievable. The little blue passport that had once made me stare in silence for nearly an hour had quietly become just another object in my drawer. Meanwhile, the ordinary conversations happening around my dinner table had become the greatest achievement of my entire life. That realization stayed with me for days. I began paying attention to the way our family communicated. Nobody was giving speeches. Nobody was trying to sound impressive. Our conversations were wonderfully ordinary. "Could you pass the bread? How was school today? I'll wash the dishes. Let's take the dog for a walk." Simple sentences. Real emotions. Real life. Ironically, those everyday conversations taught me more useful English than many textbooks ever could. When language carries real feelings, the brain remembers it more naturally. Researchers who study language acquisition often explain that people retain vocabulary more effectively when it is connected to meaningful experiences, instead of isolated memorization. Looking back, I finally understood why I had struggled for so many years. I wasn't learning words that belonged to my life. I was collecting words that rarely appeared in my daily conversations. Everything changed once I started listening differently. While shopping, I listened to friendly conversations between cashiers and customers. During neighborhood walks, I noticed how parents encourage their children. At the local library, I overheard polite greetings, quiet laughter, and simple questions. Little by little, everyday English became familiar. Not because I forced myself to study for hours, because I became curious. Curiosity is a surprisingly gentle teacher. One evening, my daughter asked if we could bake chocolate chip cookies together. The recipe was written in English. Instead of translating every word, we read each instruction slowly. Mix. Stir. Bake.
Cool.
She laughed when I accidentally measured the vanilla twice. The cookies weren't perfect. Neither was my pronunciation. Both turned out just fine. Moments like that slowly removed my fear of making mistakes. I realized that children almost never stop playing because they make one mistake. Adults often stop trying because they expect perfection too soon. That difference changes everything. Around the same time, my husband noticed another small habit. Whenever we watched a movie, I no longer reached for my phone during conversations I didn't completely understand. Instead, I listened carefully. Sometimes I guessed the meaning from facial expressions. Sometimes I understood only 70%. Strangely, 70% became enough. Confidence grows when we stop demanding 100%. The same lesson transformed many parts of my life. Marriage didn't require perfect communication. Parenting didn't require perfect decisions. English didn't require perfect grammar. Progress simply required consistency. Living in the United States also taught me to appreciate everyday politeness. People thanked bus drivers. Neighbors waved while collecting their mail. Parents apologized when their children accidentally bumped into someone. Cashiers smiled even during busy afternoons. These gestures seemed small, yet they quietly shaped the emotional atmosphere of daily life. I began practicing those habits too, not because someone told me to, because kindness is a language everyone understands. And kindness has an interesting effect. The more comfortable people feel around you, the less they notice your mistakes. One Saturday morning, I opened the kitchen drawer while looking for an extra set of keys. The blue passport was still there beneath a few travel documents. For a moment, I held it in my hands again. This time, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't cry. I didn't stare at it. Instead, I smiled with quiet gratitude. Not because the passport had changed, because I had. Months earlier, I believed that booklet represented the biggest chapter of my life. Now I understood it represented only one page. The real story continued every morning when our family shared breakfast. Every afternoon when I greeted neighbors by name. Every evening when laughter filled our dinner table instead of silence. Those ordinary moments had become my true home. As I closed the drawer, I heard my son calling from the backyard.
Mom.
Come outside. I walked through the back door and found my husband tossing a baseball with the children. They waved for me to join them. I laughed and told them I hadn't thrown a baseball in years. Then today is a good day to start, my husband replied. That sentence stayed with me. Today is a good day to start. Not just baseball. Anything. Learning English. Repairing relationships. Building healthier habits. Saying I'm sorry. Saying I love you. Listening more carefully. Beginning again. Maybe that's the lesson I hope you'll remember most from my story. Life rarely changes because of one extraordinary event. It changes because ordinary days slowly begin moving in a better direction. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I watched my children laughing while chasing one another across the yard. My husband looked at me and quietly smiled. Neither of us needed to say anything. We both understood that the happiest chapter of our lives wasn't waiting somewhere in the future. It had already begun. Still, there was one final lesson the blue passport had yet to teach me, a lesson so simple that I almost overlooked it, yet so meaningful that it completely changed the way I define success, happiness, and the legacy I hope to leave behind for my children. Happiness looks surprisingly simple. The last time I took my blue U.S. passport out of the kitchen drawer, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel pride. I didn't even remember the hour I had spent staring at it on the day it arrived. Instead, I noticed a tiny fingerprint near the corner of the cover. It was probably left there by one of my children after they had picked it up out of curiosity weeks before. I smiled without wiping it away. Strange, isn't it? Months earlier, I had treated that little blue booklet like the most valuable object in my house. Now the fingerprint meant more to me than the passport itself. Because suddenly I understood the final lesson this journey had been trying to teach me from the very beginning. The greatest treasures in life are never the things we carefully protect inside drawers. They are the people whose fingerprints quietly become part of our story. If you've stayed with me until this moment, I want to thank you. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't really about America or passports or even English. It's about something every human heart is searching for, whether we admit it or not. For a long time, I believed life moved in straight lines. Others felt painfully confusing. Some mornings I woke up full of energy. Other mornings I questioned everything. Yet somehow, through all those ordinary days, something beautiful kept growing without me noticing. Gratitude. Not the loud kind people post online. The quiet kind. The kind that appears while folding clean laundry because everyone you love is home. The kind that appears when you hear laughter coming from another room. The kind that appears when your spouse asks, "How was your day?" and actually waits for the answer. Those moments don't look impressive. They rarely become photographs.
But they slowly become a life.
Looking back now, I almost laugh at the woman who stared at that passport for an hour. She thought she was looking at the future. She was actually saying goodbye to an old version of herself. A woman who believed achievements created peace. Now I know the opposite is often true. Inner peace allows us to enjoy our achievements. Without peace, even wonderful milestones feel strangely incomplete. One evening, our family sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. Nobody was talking very much. The children were roasting marshmallows over a small fire pit. My husband quietly reached for my hand, not because anything dramatic had happened, because simple moments no longer felt too small to notice. I watched the sky slowly change from bright blue to soft shades of orange and purple. For a second, I remembered the day my passport arrived. How nervous I felt. How uncertain I felt. How desperately I wanted that little booklet to answer questions only my own heart could answer. It never could, and that realization set me free. Researchers who study happiness have repeatedly found that long-term well-being depends less on extraordinary achievements and more on clothes. Today, it feels wonderfully comforting. It means happiness isn't reserved for a lucky few. It grows quietly through ordinary choices that almost anyone can make. Call your parents. Eat dinner together. Listen before speaking. Apologize quickly. Laugh often. Protect your evenings. Put your phone down once in a while. These habits seem unbelievably ordinary. Yet they quietly shape extraordinary lives. The The funny thing is that my English improved through exactly the same process. Not because I chased perfection, because I stayed consistent. One conversation, one audiobook, one story, one mistake, one new word, then another. Looking back, language became much less frightening once I stopped treating every conversation like an exam. Life became easier after I stopped treating every challenge the same way. Around this time, neighbors occasionally asked why our family always seemed so relaxed together. I usually smiled because they were seeing the result, not the work behind it. They weren't there for the uncomfortable conversations, the misunderstandings, the evenings when we admitted we had been emotionally distant, the small decisions to eat together, to listen more carefully, to forgive more quickly. Strong families are rarely built by accident. They are built one ordinary day at a time. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, my daughter opened the same drawer where the passport had rested for months. She held it up and asked, "Mom, are you going to keep this forever?" I smiled. Of course. Then she surprised me again. "What about all our family pictures? Will you keep those forever too?" I didn't answer immediately, because I realized she had unknowingly compared two completely different kinds of treasures. One represented permission to travel. The other represented reasons to come home. Without hesitation, I answered, "The pictures matter more." She smiled. I thought so. Children sometimes understand life's biggest truths before adults do. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened the drawer one final time. I picked up the blue passport, held it for just a few seconds, then carefully placed our newest family photograph on top of it. If someone opened that drawer tomorrow, the first thing they would see wouldn't be the passport. It would be our smiling family, exactly where it belonged, because that is the real ending of my story. Not becoming someone new, but finally appreciating the life I already had. If you're listening today while practicing your English, feeling discouraged, rebuilding a relationship, or simply wondering whether your small efforts matter, let me leave you with this thought. Never underestimate ordinary days. They are quietly writing the story you'll one day be proud to remember. The Blue Booklet was never the destination. It was only a reminder. The greatest journey was learning to love the life waiting on the other side of my own front door. That's all for today. I'll make many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss them.